Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our day 3 of our 16th International Conference on Sport and Society. And I'm very glad to introduce our panel this morning because it's quite an important topic for us to consider sport and the environment in its multiple forms and the ways in which some of our current crisis of climate may make us rethink sports and physical activity, the extent to which sport reinforces and make the climate crisis worse, and the extent to which sport and physical activity can help us rethink also ways to create more sustainable words. So I'm going to introduce our panel, and I'll pass on to Dan. I'm sure it'll be exciting, provocative, insightful, and I look us all to have a very, very interesting discussion. So our first panel member is Professor Brett Hutchins. Professor Brett Hutchins is a professor of media and communications in the School of Media, Film, and Journalism in the Faculty of Arts. His research investigates who wins, who loses, and how during processes of media, technological, and environmental change. Brett has authored and edited several books, including Environmental Conflict and Media, co-edited with Lib Lester, Sport Beyond Television, the Internet, Digital Media, and the Rise of Networked Media Sport, co-authored with David Rowe, and Don Bradman, Challenging the Myth. He's also publishes regularly in leading international communications and media journals, media studies journals, and sits on the editorial board of Journal Communication, Communication Sports, and Environmental Communication, a journal of nature, culture, amongst others. Our second panelist is Professor Lib Lester. Lib Lester is Professor Research and Director of the Monash Climate Change Communications Hubs. Professor Lester's research is focused on understanding and promoting the role of communications and media in good decision-making about shared social and environmental futures. And she is recognized internationally for her work in the field of environmental communications. She has published 7 books and more than 100 journal articles and chapters. She has been a visiting fellow at Oxford University's Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. Before joining Monash in 2024, Professor Lester worked at the University of Tasmania, where she was the UNESCO Chair in Communication, Environment and Heritage, and Director of the Institute for Social Change. And our third panelist is Dr. Rebecca Olive, who is a Vice Chancellor Senior Research Fellow at RMIT University. Dr. Rebecca Olive Feminist Research explores how everyday recreational sport and leisure activities are experienced through cultural politics, ecological encounters, relationships with humans and non-humans, including on social media. At RMIT, Rebecca is based in the Center for Urban Research, where she is an associate director for the center, leading the Regenerative Environment and Climate Action theme, and co-convenes the RMIT Ocean Research and Climate Action Network. Dr. Rebecca Olive is also the president of the Cultural Studies Association of Australasia. Rebecca publishes widely across fields, including sport and leisure cultural studies, media studies, and education, and has co-edited 2 books, Women in Action, Sport Cultures, and the very recently released Head in the Game, Social Cultural Analysis of Brain Trauma Sport, like really recent released a few weeks ago. So I welcome the panel now, and over to Dan for what's to be an exciting panel.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. In setting the scene, sorry, I'm going to, without a lectern, I have a habit of feeling like you're all going to be in a game of tennis. I'll do my best to stay relatively steady. As part of the menace that is authors who get together and then come up with papers, we've changed the title of the paper from the advertised one, but it does give you a sense of how it fits together. I'd also like to, of course, as I said on the opening, acknowledge we're meeting on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and I speak as an uninvited migrant to these lands where sovereignty was never granted nor ceded. I'll also note that throughout various parts of the work that you'll see engagement with Indigenous knowledges and wisdom, particularly around land, sea and water, is part of the thinking as much as possible, particularly for when you are in fact a migrant. Plenary. What we are seeking to do. As I have a habit of doing, I looked up the etymology of the term, 15th century term coming from Latin plenarius, full or complete. So what we're going to seek to do is a couple of things. First of all, over the course of the three papers, offer a complete sense of how sport and the environment fit together, why people working on sport, physical activity and physical culture should be taking it seriously and thinking about it, while also offering a sense of depth in relation to particular papers. And hopefully by the end of it, I will then attempt to bring it all together and see whether we've actually achieved the sort of outcome of completeness. Now, in terms of, and further setting the scene, in terms of disciplinary perspectives that you'll actually be seeing between the three of us, and Lucas has done a wonderful job of making us all sound wonderful, as is his job, you will find a combination of environmental communications, cultural studies, media studies, sociology, and indeed cultural anthropology. Did I miss any? Feminist media studies and feminism. Journalism studies. So you will see that this is, multidisciplinary work, but also housed within the humanities and social sciences. And I will be coming back to that point around why the humanities and social sciences perspective on environment and climate change are quite important. Now, to my understanding of how this all comes together, you're actually seeing two projects come together, both funded by the Australian Research Council and as well as an RMIT Vice-Chancellor Senior Research Fellowship. The first one being a project titled Fields of Green, Sport as a Communication Platform for Environmental Issues, and the other investigator on that project is Professor Toby Miller, who's in Monterrey in Mexico at the moment. You also find as part of that podcast series in which Rebecca has appeared, talking about blue spaces, sport and the sea, in episode 40, Dan Henhawk, Canadian Indigenous man, talking about Indigenous physical cultures and sustainability. And as always, we like to acknowledge the hard work of the research associates who do a lot of the work on this. Dr. Janine Makosa, Dr. Simon Troon and Dr. Whitney Monaghan. The discussion around one of the athletes I'll talk about in a moment is particularly sourced from work done by Dr. Simon Troon. We also have an ARC DECRA project, the ARC being the major public funding means for research in Australia, understanding ecological sensibilities in recreational sport. Research fellowships are very prestigious. Rebecca should already be a professor because she got one as far as I'm concerned. And she also did the Saltwater Library podcast, and I'll point you to that, and episodes 2 and 5 around Indigenous ecological knowledges and native sovereignty environmental activism, and point you towards the website for a project, Moving Oceans, in which you can see a lot of the work she's doing. So that's the context. Now, bringing it all together in 20 minutes is going to be quite challenging, but in seeking to offer a sense of breadth, I think it's important that we start with politics. The ARC project that Libby and I did with Toby was actually vetoed by the Australian Federal Minister for Education. It was subject to a secret ministerial veto in which we weren't actually communicated with. We are one of 11 projects in the humanities and social sciences that were recommended for funding by possibly the world's most painful and extensive process of peer review, but subsequently declared by the minister not worth funding by virtue of everything from not value for money to frivolous. But I will point to the fact that when you start talking about the environment, the vectors of politics are impossible to ignore. Now, they found us in a way that perhaps none of us expected, and it was a strange morning when we woke up to discover, only because of a leak, that we'd in fact been vetoed. But it also speaks partly to, of course, politics in Australia, in which at least one side of politics appears to either be devoted itself in some ways, particularly the National Party, to working in the interests of the mining industry, and also delaying the transition towards renewable energy systems. So, actually, really important qualifier, and I'm mindful I'm being recorded. I am speaking as a researcher, not the Deputy Dean of Research in the Faculty of Arts. That has got me in trouble in the past. And I will also say, because I am being recorded, that the Monash Academic Freedom Policy protects my right as a researcher and an expert to say things about particular topics that I know things about. Actually, it doesn't give me a right just to sort of extrapolate on anything I might be thinking about today, but when it comes to these questions, I am speaking from a position of a researcher. And this was a difficult time and period, actually, but it has also led to, and certainly I will say actually Monash supported me very well. I think at the time the Uni of Tasmania may not have done quite as good a job in supporting Libby. Yes, sometimes one needs a push to find your spine. But yeah, so it was, and this was Libby doing really important work, and a university eventually came to the party. But again, it comes down to this question, and I'll come back to it in a moment, in that when we're talking about the environment and climate change, the question is no longer one of science. It is one of social systems, cultures, and politics. Now, to give those who haven't necessarily thought a lot about this topic, I'm sure many of you are quite knowledgeable, but just trying to think, but nonetheless sort of why, what are the ways of putting this together? And this comes out of a chapter that we wrote in a collection edited by Michael Butterworth called Communication and Sport. We did a chapter on the environment. And what you see there is the dimensions of a twin dynamic where sport is both subject to the impacts of climate change, but also a contributor to that, as well as environmental degradation. And this has arguably even more than the 7 dimensions I've laid out there, but the things that go on around sports teams, clubs, leagues, associations, major sports events and tournaments, if you think about the impact of things like the FIFA World Cup and the Olympics, sports stadiums and venues, which are very much a live political issue in Australia, and the sorts of things that go on within, particularly around recycling, not to mention, I don't think people really think too hard about the sort of environmental impact of Wi-Fi networks and mobile media usage and stuff. Sponsorship, advertising and media, particularly around the fossil fuels industries, which we'll come back to later. Equipment, clothing and ancillary industries, including media and technology. The environmental claims makers, activism, including athletes and fans and protesters that actually use sport and think about sport as a way of actually trying to create positive change, as well as the relationship between sport, built environments, infrastructures, land and waterscapes and complex ecologies. I'm going to attempt, and I think in the space of about 11 slides, to more or less cover several of these in a reasonably coherent fashion. And here's why I think sport matters. Now, the interesting thing about when you look at the environmental communications literature is you can say any number of topics matter. Art institutions, politics, airline, like you could take almost any sector in industry and say it matters in relation to environmental change and climate change. I make the case, and we make the case in fact, that sport matters and physical activity matter in a way that is really quite helpful in coming to terms with the challenges, in the sense that it serves to crystallise the dilemma of communicating and promoting environmental awareness through spectacles, events, practices, experience, technologies and infrastructures that unavoidably also generate their own significant ecological or carbon footprint. It speaks to the civilisational challenge most of us are living through. How does one create positive environmental impact while also knowing that things that we do also are part of the problem? And it's a dilemma that exists because modern sport in particular is a dirty undertaking. Now, I'm using that term in the sense of Mary Douglas, narrative ethics, work by Larry Wenner, but the things that sports connect to sticks and spreads throughout other realms of society and culture. We heard Brian Stoddard talk about how sport helps create sort of system change and things it structures. And the messages that we see represented, communicated, expressed through sport actually then spread out into other sectors. It also reveals the inescapable tensions and conflicts that constitute living in, with and through climate change and environmental degradation in late-stage capitalism. Now, trying to actually then represent this visually, what does that last point mean? And I like the example, when you're trying to actually do this, of talking about art. Now, I'm actually just going to read for a moment because I like to get this part right. But this is an art installation called The Unending Attraction of Nature by Klaus Littmann in the Wörthersee Stadium in Klagenfurt in Austria in 2019. Now, the actual painting that you see on, your left, sorry, I get my left and right confused, is by Max Pointner, and it's called The Unending Attraction of Nature. Painted in the early 1970s as part of a series, Contributions to the Future, Critics of Technology and Civilization under the Guise of Utopia. Now, it foretells of a hyper-industrialised dystopia in which nature, in this case a forest, is witnessed as a spectacle in a sports stadium, surrounded by smoking chimneys in an encroaching metropolis. In this world, nature can only be experienced by citizens as a spectacle in designated spaces like animals in a zoo. Now, I suppose if you think about the sort of land, the world beyond the stadium, there are certain cities in this world that aren't actually unlike that. I'm going to take you through some examples later. But in 2019, the Swiss artist and curator Klaus Littmann recreated Paintner's drawing by installing 299 trees in the stadium. He created basically the country's biggest ever art installation for forest. And it was a statement against catastrophic climate change and deforestation in places such as the Amazon. And he's in fact provoking audiences who enter the stadium to reflect on the fact that the social experience of nature is increasingly limited and degraded in an age of climate crisis, extreme weather events and mass species extinctions. Through his installation, Littmann makes nature the spectacle and asks those who enter to reflect on their relationship to it. And the stakes of the match being played in this stadium are existential for human and non-human actors, and mark the position of sport in the environmental crisis and the social drama as deeply significant. Perhaps unintentionally, it also speaks to the tensions that I just outlined in the previous slide, because despite its appeal and success in attracting attention nationally and internationally, Littmann's project released up to 55 tonnes of carbon dioxide by transporting the trees, and was also criticised for using foreign trees, not local ones. So his installation therefore represents a seemingly unavoidable tension that is examined in the wider research that this plenary presentation speaks to. And the question is, why does this tension exist? Why is sport in particular so laden with tensions? And it really goes back to the foundations of modern sport. Now, Friedrich Engels in 1883, and that is in the Friedrich Engels that wrote with Karl Marx, in Dialectics of Nature, which is a very strange book to read because it was actually not completed at his time of death, really talks about the fact that nature as a concept, something we think about or experience, only comes into being with culture. The physical world exists, of course, and the natural environment exists. But the concept of nature, the way we think about degradation, is actually a human idea. And Toby Miller in Greenwashing Sport talks about the fact and quotes Engels and saying that nature does not just exist, but it comes into being and passes away, which also speaks to transformation, that we're in a constant state of recreation. Now, connecting this up to a book written in 1994 that I kind of think should get a lot more attention than it kind of does, was cultural geographer or social geographer, I can't remember what was the term that he preferred, John Bale, in a book called Landscapes of Modern Sport, talks about the fact that sport is sort of occupies a uniquely ambiguous position. And this is where its value, when we're thinking about the environment and climate change, comes in. It sits somewhere between nature and culture. So modern sport events and activities, even then in 1994, 30 years ago, or over 30 years ago, really talks to a clear tendency towards extravagance and wastefulness. Therefore, if we were sort of prepared to actually look closely enough, even then we could have foretold of the future that Klaus Littmann then represents in that stadium. And interestingly enough, while social media is not always perhaps the most intellectually deep experience one can have, given the limitations of characters, the Sports Environmental Alliance actually came up with the hashtag of No Planet, No Play. Now, it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about this fact, about the relationship. It's also, I'm pretty sure, was not written after having read Friedrich Engels, but the point remains that there is a connection between the two. So why sport matters? Sorry, I'm just going to shift over here. So sport and physical activity are made possible by the relationships between the body, health, fitness, non-human actors, what Bale terms sportscapes, infrastructures and physical and atmospheric conditions. It's a deceptively complex set of activities in a deceptively diverse set of settings. So it brings us to the concept of assemblage, and a book that Rebecca put me onto, and I thank you for that. How humans, non-humans, ecology, systems, markets and institutions influence each other. The interrelationships, the complex interactions are actually what produces culture and cultural activity and social practice. And it produces emergent and sometimes unpredictable effects. So in a changing environment and climate, shifting assemblages are remaking sport and physical activity and resituating those who both watch and play. And to sort of bring this, or try and ground this into something that, you know, people, quite tangible, the Australian Open, an event that's held, in fact, if you go to the top of this building, you can actually see Melbourne Park, so it's about, 14 minutes away if you take the train, shows, and you know your train timetables. But had to introduce an air quality index because of players, particularly during the 2019-20 Black Summer bushfires, which were mega fires, that took out much of sort of the east coast of Australia and other parts, were vomiting on court due to the poor air quality. We also see the introduction of a new heat stress scale, of course, which is something that previously was not thought possible. So, the so-called arguments over the wet bulb temperature. Now, if you go through the history of temperatures throughout the Australian Open, and this is work done by the Monash Climate Change Communication Research Hub, there is a clear increase in temperatures in Melbourne over 20 years during January that make these things necessary. You also see a picture of a netballer there called Amy Steele. She played in the elite level competition in Australia called Super Netball, whose career was ended by an exertional heat stress injury. She was playing a pre-season match in Shepparton. Sufficient precautions were not taken. She was taken to hospital after collapsing and never played again. She now lives in Perth and is actually an environmental activist, unsurprisingly. So the shifting assemblages that make sport and physical activity possible are changing how we think about, organise and indeed think about changing workplaces of sports people are shifting. Now, this is kind of depressing in some ways, but let's face it, I don't have a reputation for uplifting when I'm speaking. So we have, this idea, climate change is here, it is happening, it is real, it is changing sport. So you see Carlisle United there. There are an increasing amount of flood events in the UK and indeed in Australia, particularly if you live on the northern coast of New South Wales, in which sporting venues sort of constructed in previously zones that did not flood often are now flooding far more frequently. This is impacting sport in all sorts of ways. We saw the 2019 Rugby World Cup literally interrupted by a typhoon. And the same thing also happened in the West Indies during cricket. If you are living in the northern parts of the Americas, ice and snow cover are actually dropping quite considerably. And indeed, I would put you on to a really interesting citizen science project called Rink Watch, which is showing the changing levels of ice coverage. It's a project being run by students and a researcher out of Wilfrid Laurier University. If we have any Canadians with us, I hope I got that right. The image of the cyclists there, that's a tour down under during 2019 in which cyclists literally rode through 2 days after a bushfire had literally devastated the landscape that they were riding through. 2017, test match in Delhi between Sri Lanka and India. Players were vomiting and struggling to play due to pollution in the air. And then, of course, we talk about the state of our waterways, the 2016 rowing venues. That is a picture taken of those during Brazil. Not to mention the swimmers in the Seine last year during the Paris Olympics that were literally, excuse me, I am going to swear, literally swimming in shit. So this is not a pretty picture. I'm going to try and give you some hope at some point. In our project, we actually wrote a paper called Envisioning a Green Modernity, the Future of Cricket in Climate Crisis, in which we interviewed ground curators in South Africa, the UK and Australia, as in the people who prepare cricket grounds for first class and test and international cricket. And they spoke about the way their practices have changed over the years. Pitch preparation, use of insecticides, types of insects, levels of water required. In other words, it's a bit like if you talk to, we have a scholar here called Deb Anderson who does great work with oral histories with farmers, talking about the farmers' changing experience of farming. Well, the same thing is happening here. And you see a quote there in that heat waves are common, drought and heat waves, and when you're dealing with water shortages, of course, it means you need to turn to bore water, which changes the sort of pitch preparation that's going on. So these things are all interacting while players are actually playing in hotter conditions and, well, polluted conditions or poor air quality, particularly in that case of that test match earlier. So in some senses, in painting a reasonably grim picture of where we are, that the climate crisis is in fact happening, it has been happening for quite some time now, that we're really talking about the realities of living with and through suicidal modernity, otherwise known as capitalism. Now, that's a term assigned to Ulrich Beck in a book called Metamorphosis, and it really speaks to that sport is also a site of large-scale greenwashing by mining, petrochemical, automotive and airline industries, as well as, of course, by fossil fuel-driven sovereign wealth states. And in really, if you want to think about sports events that, look, even I enjoy, I'm not going to exclude myself from any of this, but the idea of a sustainable mega event is an oxymoron. There is no such thing. It's an argument made by Ben Glasson in a piece called Reality Offsets that was published in European Journal of Cultural Studies about the Olympics. So sport is used by environmentally destructive corporate actors to claim a social licence to operate, which is something that Libby will be speaking to you about in a moment. But it's also, the symptoms are everywhere, and I'm sorry to my North American friends or American friends who have joined us, I will note that picture that, you know, you have Trump, but there's also a Swiss guy standing next to him. That really what's going on around the US World Cup, drill baby drill, is also reflected in what's happening in Australia with one of our nation's richest person, Gina Rinehart, who leads Hancock Prospecting, is using the Olympics to certainly generate a social licence to operate, and in fact she is quite proudly a member of the Trumpettes. So, and I do apologise to literally everybody in the room who is not from Australia for exporting Rupert Murdoch to you. We also have the International Cricket Council, Aramco, which is now sponsored by literally the world's biggest carbon emitter. So it's not a pretty picture. However, there is also increasing evidence of environmental advocacy, activism and protests against this state of affairs. So you see sideline events at meetings of the Conference of Parties dedicated to sport, organised by people like Madeleine Orr, who, if you are looking for a primer just to the relationship between sport and climate change, this book, Warming Up, is not a bad place to start. It's really accessible, quite well done and very readable. We have Cricket for Climate, which is an organisation, an advocacy, not activist organisation, set up by or led by Pat Cummins, the Australian national cricket captain. and is signing up athletes. You also see parts from the wider social movement and activism sector around the Australian Conservation Foundation, using cricket and a range of other sports to demonstrate the relationship between the fossil fuels industries and climate change. And you also see protest. Now, I think probably this was sitting at its most visible through the Extinction Rebellion and the Just Stop Oil protests, particularly in the UK. There was a protest that interrupted the AFL Grand Final. Sorry, I don't follow AFL even though I'm in Australia. What's the day before the Grand Final where they have the thing in town called? Yeah, I don't understand it at all. But it was interrupted by Extinction Rebellion protesters 2 years ago. The picture you see there is actually Eddie and Stott, who's an Extinction Rebellion protester, who was also a gold medal winner in the slalom canoe at the 2000 Olympics for England. So, you know, the relationship between athletes, activism, protests and so on is actually spreading. The paper that we've done coming out of this one is around David Pocock, who was captain of the Wallabies, the Australian rugby union team, a team that I will note is now sponsored by Santos, a mining company. But he's a really fascinating figure if you don't know him, in the sense that he's made quite a sophisticated transition from athlete to protester, and you see him locking himself to a coal loader in 2014 at Maules Creek in northern New South Wales as part of the Laird State blockade, for which he was arrested. You then see him with his his partner, who is actually the leader of Front Runner, not David, Emma Pocock, and she's a political advisor and sort of incredibly impressive professional in her own right, setting up an athlete activist organisation called Front Runners, that educates athletes on how to speak about climate and environmental issues with a level of confidence. And then you see him make the transition into formal politics as a member of the Senate in the ACT in 2022, who then doubled his vote in the election that was just held this year in 2025. So I suppose he's an interesting figure in trying to think through the different relationships between advocacies, activism, protest and formal politics, which is, I think, why he's worth taking a look. There is a quote from the actual paper. And this brings us to the point on which I will leave you momentarily, that we are, everything I've just speaking about, like the science is in, we are no longer dealing with only a scientific problem. We are dealing with a social, cultural and political problem. We are talking about a transition and a systemic transition and the need for political action and institutional change. So, and I think sport, in terms of of the range of things you could look at these issues with, sport is really useful in thinking through how, you know, what are climate and environmental solutions that can deliver renewable energy transition, mitigation and environmental justice. And I will also point you towards a piece, and Chris is in the audience, from the International Review of Sociology of Sport, on the sociology of sport and climate change, in which he actually points that it is the social, political and economic conditions in which sport is produced, reproduced, consumed, and I've added practiced, that create the vulnerability and unsustainability. So the question is, how do we move to the next stage? And at that point, I will hand over to Libby and get her presentation up.
That'd be great.
No, that's not mine. No, that's not yours. Sorry, everybody.
Hello everyone, and now for something completely different. So, as Brett was saying, professional sport has long offered a relatively safe harbour to the fossil fuel and other industries seeking broad public acceptance by mobilising media, advertising and sponsorship. But what we've also been trying to understand is another powerful expression of this public licensing. And in this case, in amateur community support and locally based teams, both at the junior and senior levels. So it's an inexpensive means for resource companies to reach into and communicate with communities and citizens. And it's also effective because of sport's long-standing role in embodying notions of shared endeavour, collective identities and histories, and importantly, social cohesion. So we've been looking at this in relation to what we've been calling company towns. These are rural and regional population hubs in which employment prospects and the local economy rely on one dominant industry, such as agriculture, mining, or aquaculture. And these industries are often represented by a single company. So the value extracted relies on the company accessing both local landscapes and natural and human resources to grow their businesses and markets. And then this is enabled by community and political support that legitimises the extractive operations and profits. So it's a remarkably cost-effective way for industries to legitimise, maintain and grow their social licence is through sport sponsorship. Funding and advertising of local sporting clubs and teams, both, as I say, at the senior and junior levels. And despite obvious variations, media plays a really important role at the local level, just as it does at global media sport. Meaning is shared by a parent recording a junior football game and uploading it to Facebook or YouTube, players sharing images of games and club events via WhatsApp groups, and coverage of a team's award night in the local newspaper. Also corporate and sustainability websites. So these interactions are constituted by the meta process of mediatisation, and if you want a definition of that, you can talk to Brett later, which is central to the ways in which effective and polluting industries and communities they impact, announce, negotiate and defend their own or others' resources and landscapes. So social licence to operate is a pretty nebulous notion, about as nebulous as the notion of this thing called a community. So this is how we've been thinking about those terms. So the term social licence emerged from the confines of the mining industry in the 1990s. It was a way of limiting, quote, the actions of organisations that pollute the environment, put employees at risk, produce dangerous goods, etc. It was suggested that all organisations operate under an implicit social licence. But, of course, over time and as it spread to other sectors, including forestry and agriculture, the concept's original intent became open to interpretation and eventually exploitation. At the heart of the struggle over the term was this thing called a community, with industry attempting to bound and limit the idea of a community. This reduces the scope of those who have a right to comment or be compensated in the event of adverse environmental or social impacts. It also counters the national and international flow of media messages and claims that create transnational communities of concern, most notably international environmental campaigns. So, as an example, Japanese buyers of Australian or Malaysian timber or aquaculture products want to be, for their own environmental, corporate and social responsibility endeavours, want to know that there is no conflict or minimal conflict at the site of procurement. So hence, resource companies are those who are part of the start that one again. So resource companies that are part of the Tasmanian forestry or aquaculture industries want a clearly delineated community where there is evidence of not only acceptance for their extractive industries, but visible community support. And that's where sport comes in. So being a part of a community occurs in so many different settings, scales and ways. For example, local community, an online community, a fan community. But in the case of rural and regional areas, these trends tend to be a relatively neat, there tends to be a relatively neat alignment between the industries that rely on a resource from a place and the people themselves who inhabit that place. So community here is a geographically limited social realm constituted by interactions between residents, seasonal and habituated social practices, cultural norms and values, local traditions and histories, media and communications, and economic conditions and employment patterns. Sport is situated right across that mix. Thus, in company towns, club or competition sponsorship is an opportunity to make the costs of community sporting clubs and teams bearable while embedding the company's brand at the centre of community life. This embedding is deepened by the fact many employees and their families are involved in community sport clubs, meaning the company is a consistent presence during working hours, at training and on weekends. And that brings us to the under 9 Triabunnaroos. I'll just play this for a quick second. Have a look at the maroon, the logo on the back of the maroon team. No, it didn't work. No, not going to work. That's okay. We've lost that little clip of the under 9 Roos. On the back of all their logo, of all their jerseys, is the Tassal logo. So I'll give you a few points of context. Oh, and here we go. And now I've got to get back to the PowerPoint. Oh, there it is behind. It's okay. There we go. Oh, no, can't get past it. No, that one. Right. Okay, so Triabunna is a small town on the east coast of Tasmania. It's unlike many of its neighbours. It doesn't really have much of a tourism opportunities, in part because it was home to a giant wood chip mill for a long while, and right next to the wood chip mill was a rather stinking blood and bone fertiliser factory. So both of those have now closed, and that's left Tassal as the major employer. So Tassal is Tasmania's largest 3 Atlantic salmon producers. It's owned nowadays by the Canadian giant Cook Seafoods. There are 2 other companies. One is Huon Aquaculture, which is now owned by the very controversial Brazilian company called JBS, and the third one is Petunia, which is owned by Sealord in New Zealand. A few points about Tasmania for context. So, at a latitude of 42 degrees, with a complicated coastline comprising numerous estuaries and offshore islands, Tasmania is the ideal site for cold water salmon production. So overall, 60% of all Australia's aquaculture is produced in Tasmania, with salmon production dominating. Salmon farming has grown from 56-tonne harvest in the late 1980s up to 83,000 tonnes in 2020-2021, and state government wants to double that again. It's now the island's single biggest primary industry and employs all up about 2,000 people. Second point about Tasmania. Tasmanians have the highest rate of Tasmanians have the lowest levels of education of any Australian state. For example, only 23% of people in Australia's most southerly town, Dover, where a lot of the aquaculture industry is situated, only 23% have completed Year 12, with 39% working in agriculture, forestry or fishery industries. Third important point about Tasmania. Tasmanians have the highest rate of recreational boat ownership in Australia, and coastal shacks have long been a way of life, particularly for working class people. But this now extends well into the capital city-based middle classes, the cultural elites and the politically active. Fourth point, Tasmania's world famous for bitter and continuing environmental conflict over the development of its landscapes and wilderness. Began in the 1970s with hydroelectric developments, which led to the birth of the world's first Greens Party, and has seen thousands upon thousands arrested. So what could possibly go wrong? So some critical moments in the now decade-long conflict over salmon farming have included a formal Senate inquiry and an investigation by Four Corners, which is the ABC's premier investigative journalism program. Concerns have included influx of algae, destruction of the marine environment, lack of regulation, antibiotic use, cruelty to seals. The industry's expansion has interrupted the way of life for many Tasmanians, with salmon pens turning these lovely little estuaries into industrial landscapes. 2021 book criticised the industry by one of the state's most prominent citizens, Booker Prize-winning author Richard Flanagan, and that led to a lot of restaurants, both in Tasmania and the mainland, removing salmon from their menus. More recently, the industry has been blamed for the decline and likely extinction of the Maugean skate, found only in Macquarie Harbour on the west coast. While in the first half of this year, and sorry about the gruesome nature of that photo, globules of rotting fish were washing up, rotting fish fat were washing up on a lot of the southeastern beaches, including the tourism mecca of Bruny Island. The cause, over a million fish died from a bacterial infection. To make matters worse, Tassal was then filmed putting live salmon into these containers with dead salmon for landfill. So how is sport implicated in all this? So a few examples drawn mainly from Tassal about how the salmon producers situate themselves as locals and part of the community. According to the industry body Salmon Tasmania, 3,730 hours and 1.6 million was donated in 2022 to local programs as part of industry grants, donations and community investment. Tassal gave $270,000 in direct community support and donations of $13,400 worth of mules. In the usual way of corporate reporting, People and Communities is one of 7 responsible business accelerators aligned to Tassal's core purpose. Tassal mentions the word community no less than 46 times in its 75-page sustainability report. A Tassal Facebook page titled Our Community, has around 4,000 followers, aims to provide information and, quote, promote our activities within the community and the places where we work. They will answer all your questions. We have access to our staff on the ground, independent scientists, stakeholders within our community, even our CEO. If we don't know, we'll find out and get back to you within 24 hours. Tassal is, quote, always proud to be a major sponsor and supporter of the community-driven Triabunna Football Club here in Tassie. The Roos are part of the Oatlands District Football Association, and besides the jerseys, Tassal provides salmon for the community fry-up every Good Friday. So here the company is, quote, thrilled to have a Tassal rep at their presentation last weekend with some familiar Tassal faces, winning Clubman of the Year and the Coaches Award for 2022. This is what community sport is all about. The Tassal Facebook page introduces its audience to NOAA, Our people are our heartbeat, and one of those people is Noah. The post details Noah's education and position at Tassal. And then Noah says, Tassal has a strong sense of community, and I have found that being part of a team environment from a young age in sport has really helped me, both in and out of work. So the company has a commitment to our family. Tassal families love the community they work in. And on it goes. So here we see the spread and containment of environmental messages at multiple levels through the Salmon Company's self-representation of their relationship with community and the embedding of sport in their brand, marketing and social licence to operate. Even at this level, sport is a deceptively powerful actor in complicating environmental and human rights. That is, the rights of communities and citizens to be involved in the future of their landscapes and their resources without fearing the loss of access to work, community and education facilities, and their lifestyles, indeed. So such access is tenuous for anyone living and working in a company town, where being part of our family means being part of industry marketing. Companies are marketing their brands, and in the process, they're branding their communities. So the effect is to ensure the complicity of locals in promoting the company and creating evidence for export markets of minimal conflict over environmental harm at the site of production. In turn, the local community becomes the only community that matters, as these corporate communications ignore, play down, or delegitimise other communities of environmental concern, whether those be in international markets or networks of environmental activists. So the game being played here situates community support within a much larger game of environmental claims making that is being done by extractive industry operators with market ownership networks that extend nationally, regionally and globally. Community support is serving as an effective mechanism that depoliticises environmental harm while generating evidence of a social licence to operate to distant buyers. And they're protecting significant profits for extractive industries in national and international markets and managing state regulators. And in the contemporary company town, the industries are managing to do all this for sometimes little more than the cost of a sponsored team jumper and an annual salmon barbecue held in a clubhouse festooned with a company name. So thank you.
Thanks, Brett. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for organising this panel, Brett in particular, but also the conference organisers. And it's been really lovely to be here and see some of the presentations yesterday. So for the best part of the last decade, I've been focused on how participation in everyday recreational swimming and surfing and a little bit sailing as well, how participation shapes our relationships to coasts and oceans, and how participation in sports can activate a sense of connectedness to ecologies. So for a lot of folk, swimming and surfing in oceans, as well as in rivers and reservoirs and canals and lakes as well. I'm focused on oceans. So it's part of their everyday life, and they spend a lot of time in the water. So I'm going to focus on swimming today, not surfing. So as I've swum and talked with swimmers in Queensland and New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, Western Australia, and over in the UK, I've come to learn how they make worlds through their swimming practices. The people of their swim groups, the waters they swim in, the critters they swim with, they all become part of these people's everyday lives and worlds and communities. They know the local seasons, the animal migrations and the weather patterns, the ebbs and flows, the moments of erosion and flooding, the storms, the conflicts, the calm. So this is possible because swimming as an informal act is an informal sport. It's a way of being in water, of connecting, of collecting food, of travelling, of putting ourselves out of our depth. When we're immersed in the ocean, we're out of our usual land-based element, which, as Kate Moles says here, entangles us and makes us vulnerable as part of multi-species ecologies. This includes animals and plants, weather and the climate, but it also includes technologies and histories and spirits, ancestors, economies and pollution. On land, I find it pretty easy to forget the effects of how I'm part of an ecology. We poison the insects out of this room, we close ourselves in from the cold and the weather. But I breathe here, I belong here, and unless there's an earthquake, the land stays in place under my feet. I'm very lucky where I live, but when I think of myself in the ocean, my otherness and my out-of-placeness is always apparent. I'm floating out of my depth, kicking my legs, keeping my head above water, and wondering, who else is swimming with me? And of course there's the critters, and I'm going to get to them. But when I swim, I'm immersed also with histories, memories, spirits, and ancestors. So acknowledging that the past is alive in the present highlights the cultural politics that are always part of how we swim. Amble and Quay Molina's words here are with me when I go about my work. But so is Lisa Slater's question, how can settlers like her and I, how can we stay well on stolen land? Slater's question recognises that our presence as settlers isn't going to disappear anytime soon. So what can we do to minimise further harms? Extending Slater's question to also consider how we can stay well as one species of many on this planet is not to separate thinking about the enduring politics of colonisation. The commonly used term Anthropocene recognises the impact of humanity on the climate, but other scholars focus on the specificity of human practices that are at the core of climate change. These scholars use the term Capitalocene, a word that reflects the impacts of ideologies of profits, growth and competition, of human exceptionalism over non-humans, all of which is underpinned by imperialism and colonisation, and I would add patriarchy too. A willingness to extract, to consume, to dump, to work to death, to render extinct. This is all tied to some people's sense of our right or entitlement to do so. Philippe Pignare and Isabel Stengers describe this as capitalist sorcery, as spells that are spun to turn everything, people, minerals, animals, water, air, all of these things into resources to be extracted and polluted for human consumption. Capitalist sorcery makes people like us complicit in destroying lives and environments. It's so effective that we don't even notice this sorcery anymore, even going so far as conflate it with morality, aesthetics, and our own exceptionalism as a species. The magic of the spells is beguiling. It's difficult to break free from. In forthcoming work, Lisa Slater discusses colonial infrastructures of the heart, and she uses an example of the naturalisation of the human nature binary as a key example. As with capitalist sorcery, Slater writes that, and I quote her here, infrastructures of the heart are a ruse, a colonial con job that enables settlers to resubstitute and sustain Western ontologies and marginalise other ways of knowing. But she also writes that experience has taught me that disturbing taken for granted perceptions is fundamental to becoming more alive to other ways of knowing. These disruptions are not necessary for everyone, and many people already embody worldviews that resist these sorceries. But for people like me, we need some disruption. So I may be hopefully following the last two presentations, but hopefully proposing that activities like ocean swimming and surfing can act as a counterspell to these sorceries, con jobs and infrastructures of the heart. This is possible in all kinds of sports, of course, and physical activities. So walking, hiking, mountain biking and paddling. For me, it's really been swimming and a bit surfing too. So swimming doesn't look the same for everyone. For me, it's about 1 kilometre or so across, in Melbourne anyway, across the bay with friends or around the bay. While for other people, like on this hot summer day in Stone Town in Zanzibar, it's spontaneous play. It's interaction with water and waves, as well as family, tourists, stone walls, boats, empty plastic bottles, sand, fish, and an incoming tide. In Bondi, it might be an ocean pool that only goes so far in holding back the tides and storms. And this pool was recently damaged quite badly in big surf. The metal poles were bent and the windows were smashed in. I was once swimming in there and someone was washed out of the pool onto their back on the poolside while we're in the water. So further up the coast in Newcastle, the very popular Merriweather bars were recently closed to ensure a population of sea hares were safe from people. Or in Geelong, just down the coast, where lifeguards offer minimal intervention as young people and adults, I was there, play on the boardwalk and climb the lifeguard tower to jump from the roof. From what I've seen, Eastern Beach is a truly public space. But in all cases, however the swimming is, whatever characterises ocean swimming, it's the encounters over which we have no control that stand out. Of course, there's the critters. The fish and birds and seaweed, the jellyfish, dolphins, and all the many things, all the many living beings that we swim with and which delight us. But there's also pollution, chemicals, plastic, oil and storm debris, and all of this we absorb into our bodies and we excrete them in return. And then there are the encounters with the literal and metaphorical encounters with histories and infrastructures, technologies like drones and boats, and the various policies that shape our experiences of swimming in public. We swim with violence, death and love. We swim with cables and rules. We swim with ancestors, even if we don't know it. So these encounters all can make us feel vulnerable, but there are some critters that make vulnerability much more immediately consequential. In many places, ocean users regularly encounter sharks, even without noticing or realising when you're having these encounters. As a critter floating on the surface, we can easily become prey. And death by shark bite or a shark attack is incredibly traumatic for families and for the communities in which these attacks happen, especially when there's multiple attacks in one place. But it also remains an unlikely experience for people, with only a small number of people killed each year. In some places, it's toxic jellyfish that can cause very painful injuries, which is something that I learned the hard way. In forests, in rivers and on mountains, hikers and fishers have similar experiences with animals like coyotes, bears and wolves. Even wasps and mosquitoes or midges, they remind us that we're part of a food chain. In the Iberian Peninsula, orcas have been attacking the rudders of yachts, in some cases causing them to sink. You know about this? Yeah. There's no record of an orca killing a human outside of when they're trapped in an ocean park and forced to perform. But from play to revenge, there's various theories as to why this pod of orcas so have it in for yachts. Of course, the vulnerability swimmers and surfers feel doesn't always disrupt their beliefs in the direction I'm hoping that they do. Most swimmers and surfers are people who are used to feeling safe and having their security ensured. We live in safe places outside of war zones. We feel secure on the street, although for women and trans people, that's a negotiated position. And we want to feel safe in the ocean too. So we argue that the government should install nets, institute culls, or else communities take matters into their own hands. They kill the animals they don't want to be vulnerable to. But at the same time, swimmers and surfers fight for cleaner rivers, for marine reserves, and for less development on the coast. They're delighted by the encounters that they have with other animals, with dolphins and whales and turtles and rays. Nothing is really straightforward. So I came to all of these tensions through feeling my own vulnerability when I was swimming with friends across a bay on a warm summer day up on the north coast, not in Melbourne. It's not a very dangerous swim, but it can be quite if you're experienced and competent swimmer, but it can be quite away from shore, and we do share the water with waves, with boats, with surfers, and with sharks. So I was halfway across the bay when I suddenly felt how, if anything happened to me, if a shark bit me or a boat hit me in the head or no one would get me in time, I would drown. I'd die. Seeing that it was as far to continue to the other side as it was to go back to where I'd come from, I rallied myself and I decided to just keep swimming. At that time, I was reading Australian eco-feminist Val Plumwood. I was reading her work about being attacked and nearly killed by a crocodile. For Plumwood, the attack shattered the illusion of human superiority, and it made her feel how people can be prey, how we're part of food chains. It changed her world. My much less dramatic experience had a similar effect on me. I realised that my fear of the ocean and its critters wasn't as strong as my willingness to be part of that world, to be vulnerable to it. Everyday activities like ocean swimming are practices that can challenge the embodiment of ideologies of human exceptionalism by resituating humans in ecological terms at the same time as resituating non-humans in ethical and cultural terms. The idea that humans have supremacy over nature has, as Plumwood explains, been functional for Western culture in enabling it to exploit nature with less constraint, but it also creates illusions by denying embeddedness in and dependency on nature, denies that interconnectedness. It's allowed justifications of all kinds of extractive and polluting practices, many of which you've heard on, and I'm about to add to that list. It's allowed a justification of ensuring oceans are safe for people's leisure by enacting shark bite mitigation measures like nets and culls. It enables justification of support for projects towards the colonisation of Mars, Earth's moon, and the night sky by satellites, of exploitation of people to access the minerals in stolen lands, of exporting unwanted electronics and clothing to places like Ghana, as though the objects and their burdensome decay never existed for the original owners at all. In practice, many people continue to live as though we will have security from the environmental and social devastation of climate change, or at least there'll be security for those who can afford it. As Ariel Saleh reminds us, a light green middle class can coexist quite comfortably with capitalist despoilation of the world because it can afford to eat organically grown food and buy houses in unpolluted places. Disrupting the comfort that so many of us feel in our everyday lives in a way that challenges how we relate to the non-human world is much easier in theory than in practice. But we need to reconsider the possibilities of how to stay well together on this planet. And there are plenty of examples of where this is happening, and we've seen some already this morning. Following my ocean sport theme, groups like Surfrider Foundation, Surfers Against Sewage, they've been running for decades, with organisations like Surfers for Climate, Divers for Climate and Swimmable Cities emerging more recently. All of these organisations are active from grassroots community levels through to lobbying government officials, and many of them also work in collaboration with First Peoples. Yolanda Waters from Divers for Climate has been particularly committed to promoting the work of ocean conservationists from diverse cultural and ethnic backgrounds, as well as young people. So these groups have rallied thousands of people for protests, workshops, information sessions, petitions, and actions for change in their everyday lives, as well as in policy. And their momentum only seems to be growing. Recently, I was chatting with Kate Moles, who I quoted earlier, because we both study swimming, and we were chatting about how swimming, of course, isn't the absolute answer to capitalist sorcery, because the problems themselves aren't individual. But changing the minds and beliefs of the people who consume the most materials, resources and capital is essential for change. So sports like swimming are not entirely the answer, but they certainly do help us think and feel our way through the questions of how to stay well. Thank you.
All right, and seeking to bring this together very quickly, Lucas, because I know we need to move to questions. Look, we've travelled from professional sport to community sport to everyday or informal sport in an effort to actually come to terms with the scale of the problem, the complexity of the assemblages that make sport and physical activity possible, but also the ways they might be changed if we engage differently, if we think differently. What are the political actions? You're also seeing a different range of perspectives on how each of us think about this problem. And, you know, I thank both of you. It's been a genuine pleasure trying to put this together and bring it together. And I think in terms of the different perspectives you've seen, it actually gives you a sense that we are, you know, this is a multi-transdisciplinary issue. That indeed the classrooms you teach in are core to actually creating the changes that we require, the institutions we work in, and indeed advocacy within them is important. Now, because I have a habit of finishing on relatively glum notes, I'm going to try and lift the tone. And this question is, where is the hope? Now, I'm not someone, look, I'll just be really clear. I know I'm not going to speak on behalf of my co-presenters. I'm not someone who believes that I should have to leave audiences with hope, okay? I think questions, thoughts, provocations, yes. Hope, not necessarily. But there is hope in the sense of notions of, you know, what Beck calls emancipatory catastrophism. Always pick terms you can actually say. In some ways, we are condemned to shape the future in order to survive, given the state of the field. I think Rebecca's presentation gives you a sense of, you know, where that hope and possibility is by being in nature, swimming, changing our relationship to it. But sport and physical activity can and need to be organised, played and thought about differently. And I think part of my frustration is around the fact that this idea that the problem is too big and it can't be done. And I would ask you to look at the global sports industries during COVID. Changing schedules, locations. It is possible for that transformation to occur if the will and the energy. Now we talk about capitalist sorcery and a range of other things that, you know, or suicidal modernity. It is indeed part of the problem, but there is a logic here that can be thought about, and I do think it's around envisioning a different future, and I think we have a large role to play in it. And I would point you towards Future 2050, which was the BBC series on trying to imagine a different future. Now, in finishing out, let's not do that. That's not photoshopped. That's real. Okay, I'll just read what that is. This was Sunday, October 19 in 2002. The temperature is over 40 degrees. It's Badley Park on the southern fringe of Cessnock, which is in northern New South Wales. The Curry Curry Station Stallions are playing the Cessnock supporters. It's a third grade match. I've played many of them in trying to move up the grades. That continued in the face of an approaching bushfire. The game continued for another hour after that photo was taken. It foretells a future that might be best to avoid. And I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brad, Libby, and Rebecca. This panel has been, for myself, everything that I had hoped for in all these strands. Many provocations. Questions from the audience?
Thank you very much for amazing presentation, and especially Rebecca. I do open water, and I'm training a couple people open water in Sydney as well. So I absolutely understand what you're talking about. But at the same time, connecting the nature, connecting the ocean, we know how amazing it is. At the same time, I think as a lot of people, connecting the nature also creates fear. You know, how many of you thought that, great, but I'm not doing that because I don't like sharks, you know? Even like a Brett's case, like I play water polo, and I play water polo in the ocean, I got stung by a blue bottle, like I'm not doing that. So how do we, you know, while we're promoting doing that, connecting the nature, how can we deal with those fears so that we can actually promote better or bring more people in?
It's a very good question. I think, so in writing about nature-based sport, a lot of the time there's very romanticised ways of talking about it. And in literature about swimming, it's universally romanticised, which I find very frustrating because they don't deal with things as they are. The ocean is a dangerous place. It's absolutely terrifying, existentially and literally, a terrifying place. And for me, it became that question of, yes, but this is how things are. So am I going to kill the things that scare me in order to fake that this ocean can be a safe place in which I personally can thrive? Or am I willing to be part of that feast? And in my fields, there's big debates between two teams called transhumanism and posthumanism. And to put it in a very simplified way, transhumanism sort of has an interest in the possibilities of technological intervention so that we can technologise our way out of this. Posthumanism has a different take, which is to rethink how we live in the world and the impacts that we have on the world, to rethink how we're part of it. So not to think about the human as exceptional, but as part of. We are different. We're a species. We're a very different kind of species. But we are part of something. So for me, in my work, focusing on those aspects that aren't just the delightful and the joyful and the things like, Julia Baird writes a lot about awe and wonder, and that's beautiful work. But it's not the whole picture. The whole picture is also those risks and threats that I take in order to be able to access those beautiful experiences. There's a quote from one of my participants where he was talking about drone footage, and he says that, people have learned what kind of creatures are there, but what they've also learned that if you want to be able to go out and swim with a whale and have that experience of hearing the whale song underwater, you also need to put yourself in the way of the shark. So it's that willingness to be immersed in that risk. But the other side of that, when it comes to pollution and chemicals, is then sometimes we want to take ourselves out, but then that helps me understand who else can't get out of that water. So I think I don't know how to answer your question in the sense of encouraging more people to come in by sanitising or faking the risks that they're going to take. I went with a friend recently to the beach and it was quite rough, but I wouldn't have put her at unnecessary risk in surf. And she went, "Could we die today and if we go swimming?" And I was like, yeah. It's always a possibility. So I don't know how to answer your question in terms of encouraging people to come. But yeah, I think that we do need to always be honest about the truth of the ocean.
Can I just add quickly too, I think the important thing about encouraging more people is the fact that choice remains. Yeah. So I'm not going to get eaten by a shark if I never go in the water. So, and I think that is actually really important as a way of making these activities desirable. And in terms of swimming with whales, and last week in Tasmania, I really thought I was going to die from cold. It was unbelievably freezing. And I did think this is just going to be death.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentations. I have a question, I think, more related to football in specific, but I think also applies to other sports. I teach environmental sustainability and soccer at the United States. And last time when I was prepping my course, several documentaries from Congo and African countries came out about the extraction of the technology that makes our lives greener, for instance, like electrical vehicles. But that involves child exploitation, that involves a lot of problems to those communities. But at the same time, that's the narrative that sports organizations are using to make our lives more sustainable. So that involves a complex problem. How sports organizations should position themselves in this type of discussions? It's
a good question, and I think throughout the project, we've looked at a lot of different sports, and the way I think about, and I'm obviously reasonably critical, it's the way I'm trained, but you see an organisation like World Rugby and their sustainability plan. Now and we've interviewed people from World Rugby. That literally came from staff working in World Rugby, coming together as a group, advocating for action, and you end up with one of the more detailed sustainability plan with measurables and things. The issue with some other organisations, and football industries are key here. I mean, football is addicted to gigantism. How big do we need the World Cup to be? Do we really need the Club World Cup like this? You just think about the travel involved in all this. You get other organisations like FIFA who are talking about sustainability, and this is the paper I talked to around by Ben Glasson about called Reality Offsets. If you go through their documents and their corporate documentation and their sustainability plans very carefully, they're largely about some future state that we'll arrive at. I've been into any number of industry conferences. It's one advantage of funding is that you get to go to them. And I think at my second one, I kind of had to take a break in the second day because if I heard the word journey once more, I was going to get myself thrown out. We're on a journey, but no one wanted to talk about where we are. It was always about this perfect future state that we'll get to, while at the same time not changing our production chains, the way we organise events, reducing travel. The other thing we did is, just before this project started actually, was we worked with the CSIRO. It's a piece into the conversation in which we actually estimated the carbon emissions produced by the 4 major football codes in Australia and then proposed different ways of organising competitions to reduce them. It was quite a practical way. And people could literally play with the dashboard in the article so they could actually see. So if you had more intercity games or teams within cities, you'd actually see a considerable drop rather than flying the Wellington Phoenix in the A-League to play the Perth Glory twice a year, which is literally the world's largest long-distance derby sort of thing. And this is the thing. And I'd ask you, look, so I think in terms of where you're trying to encourage your students to think about it, it's like, what are those organisations in your world where you can actually see the movement, the measurables, the targets, the things being delivered and the things being announced proudly versus aiming for this, I think the discussion of capitalism throughout all this is really, it's a compromised existence by definition, living under. There's just no way around it. But I also find it extremely frustrating and have been known to get into public arguments around the fact I don't understand why making something a little bit better is a problem, whereas you deal with climate change deniers and, I can talk about travel, but if I get on a plane tomorrow, I have no right to comment any longer. Well, I have actually reduced my international travel, thanks very much. Why is it other institutions, we can talk about progress towards something, but when it comes to environmental or climate issues, if you're not living that perfect future, you invalidate your right to comment.
And I think around the infrastructure issue too, and I think that, to many points, the example, I don't know how many of you are aware of the situation that's going on in Tasmania at the moment over the demand that to be able to have an AFL football team, even though I might say Tasmania's produced some of the best AFL footballers over the last century. Anyway, to be able to actually have a team in the national competition, the association has demanded that Tasmania build a new stadium. Tasmania can't afford to build that stadium. We don't have functioning hospitals, we don't have functioning schools, and the debt is massive. The debt is so great that about 3 weeks ago, the government fell over the level of debt that is basically being demanded by the Australian Football League. And so less than a year after their last election, we're back at election over this issue. It is just the most remarkable situation, yet it's exactly as you're talking about, this notion that it is just, that's the way things are done. It's not an unreasonable demand, either from environmental or social context.
Yeah, I will also add, I mean, we're not really answering your question by being, again, very hopeful, but one of the problems is the rigidity of sporting organisations. Their complete, unwillingness to imagine different ways that they could operate. So it's not just the future of the world that has to be different, it's sport. And we see this across all kinds of studies of sport, and it will have been in many of the presentations here. I do a lot on gender in sport. There is the unwillingness for sports to give to make any change to men's sport in order to accommodate women and people of diverse, genders is absolute. The work I'm doing with colleagues on concussion, sports really care, but they're not building out full contact and the absolute, it's impossible not to get head injuries in all sports, to be honest, but especially in competitive. So they go, oh, we really care, but they don't change anything because, as you said, that's just the way it's always done. So until there are, and even yesterday, the discussion of how trying to change sports media so it's not only ex-athletes who are always commentating or coaching. I mean, there's nothing more dull. Than listening to blokes talk story in a cricket commentary box. That's just dull, and it doesn't invite in anyone new, because unless you know the whole backstory of those stories, you can't enjoy the commentary. So it's a much bigger story about sports' unwillingness to change as an institution and to imagine other ways that it could be. I went to the Sport Positive event a couple of years ago, and the most represented sport that I saw there, well, there were two: golf, which are now arguing they're biodiversity havens, and F1. Now, F1, there is absolutely no way possible for F1 to be sustainable, but they had a car in the middle of the place. They talk about carbon emissions maybe from the fuel, but I just think about the tyre waste. Tyres are not recyclable. They shed into water systems, so it really is not, incremental change, we're so far past that now. Like Brett said, an unwillingness to do really anything except what just lets them look good in their next, press release. It has to be fundamental, structural change, cultural change. And that's why I think none of us are sitting up here very hopeful about organised sport, because we don't see it in any other part of their social practice. Sorry.
Do not be sorry, Rebecca. That is great, and that's why I really wanted this panel on. I want all of us to be miserable today and think about our impending death, okay? On that note, let's continue the conversations in smaller groups as we have our morning tea, and remembering that we have to be up by 10:45 for our session. So thank you very, very much for our panel members. And I invite you all to breakfast.